Less than 20 years after Cook's voyage of discovery, the first fleet arrived off the shores of Australia. This is what we learn at school, isn't it? In 1788, the first Europeans ever to settle in Australia arrived in Botany Bay. It was a hugely ambitious project. Around about 1,500 people, men, women and children, mostly convicts, transported to an unknown land 17,000 kilometres away. And that was the start of the biggest migration of humans by sea in history. It was a grim time in England. Petty crime was spiralling out of control. The jails were so overcrowded that the hulks of old ships were being used to house prisoners. England was running out of space, and the quick cure to her social ills was to send the problem offshore. At the time of the First Fleet, 23 women were convicted in London of offences that carried the death penalty. All were pardoned, provided they were prepared to go to New South Wales for the rest of their natural lives. Of the 23, only 16 agreed. The other 7 elected to die rather than come here to Australia. This is the place that England's criminals considered a fate worse than death. For men at this time, the death penalty meant being hanged. But women who committed serious crimes could still be burned at the stake. That they were prepared to risk that terrible fate shows the desperate fear they had of being exiled to the other side of the world. Today, most Australians treat a convict connection as a source of pride. So having a first fleeter in the family is a bit like being minor royalty.
My great-great-great-great-grandmother was sentenced to hang for stealing at gunpoint coins from her employer.
My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was Edward Kimberley. He was arrested near Coventry for stealing several parcels of muslin.
Lydia was my great-great-great-great-grandmother. She was sentenced to death in 1786 for stealing 10 yards of printed cotton.
He was transported to Australia for 7 years on the First Fleet.
14 years transportation.
7 years transportation to Australia.
Helen, Wayne and Cheryl belong to an elite club. Although identifying with rogues and scallywags is a national pastime in Australia, convict roots or otherwise. Most Australians today also recognise that their convict relatives stepped ashore onto a land that was already occupied. Watching their arrival were the original inhabitants of Australia, the Aborigines. If you want to talk about Australian ancestry, Professor Eric Wilmot's family tree goes back not 200 years, but literally thousands. If we'd been Aboriginal people looking out to sea on that day, what would we have seen?
You'd have seen a group of what appeared to be human beings land here. They appeared human, like the people watching them. But once you got close to them, they appeared different. For Aboriginal people, it was a fascinating idea that they weren't as alone in this part of the world as they thought they were.
But I've heard that they thought what they were seeing was something like ghosts or cloud people.
Well, the cloud person thing came from their ships, because the ships appeared on the horizon like clouds, which slowly, if you watch them, they turned into ships here. And these were the people from the cloud ships. And the clothes had splashes of white over them. Now, white is a kind of an alarm colour. If you look at an Aboriginal ceremony, main dancers come in, the ones that are supposed to carry a bit of shock, don't be painted white. These guys walk around and they got brilliant white on their uniforms, mixed with a bit of red and other colours.
So they could have some potential for badness about them?
Oh, absolutely. They could have infected them with spirits of the long past, or perhaps spirits that they didn't even know about.
Did they want to get rid of them?
Not at first, but then they did, because the British had become both a threat and too much trouble.
And that was just their first impression. The arrival of the First Fleet marked the start of an English colony in Australia, which only happened because of Cook's journey in the late 18th century. But that's the British story. Many other nations were sailing the high seas in a race to find a great southern land. And there's one first contact theory that blows all others out of the water. I'm heading to a secret location not all that far from where Captain Cook first landed. My guide is an environmentalist named Jake Kasser, who subscribes to a very radical take on history. What's more, he's going to show me the evidence. Well, this is the last place you'd expect to see Egyptian hieroglyphs, isn't it? There are so many. There's a load over here, and up here as well. Do we know what they say?
There's a story I heard from an old lady when I was a young fella growing up not far from here, and this is just local folklore, Tony. 2 Egyptian princes came out here, of course, all the way from Egypt and ended up shipwrecked. And they've made their way up the hill where one of the brothers got bitten by a snake, and this may be a representation of the snake here with the horned viper, and the 2 little birds may represent the Egyptian princes. So one of the brothers was bitten by a snake and passed away, and the other Egyptian brother lived his life out here with the local tribe.
So this is independent Aboriginal folklore that tells the same story about Egyptians?
Yeah, well, there's a group out at Penrith, a tribe out in the Sydney area, that apparently use a lot of Egyptian words in their language. Also in Western Australia, they say that they've got the same word for sun, Ra.
There's a criticism, isn't there, that actually the Egyptians didn't have the technology to sail boats all this way 4,000 years ago.
I've heard that, but if the Aboriginal people came over on canoes and the Maori went to the land of the long white cloud in canoes, I can't see why the Egyptians couldn't do it. I mean, they had flushable toilets a couple of thousand years before Christ.
You're very robust about this, aren't you? You believe it?
Well, if it is genuine, then it could really change history the way we know it.
Just a bit, mate. I love Jake's passion, and I love the fact that he's determined to believe that it's all true. But look at me, I'm just an old English sceptic. To me, the idea that an Egyptian civilization discovered Australia 4,000 years ago is just very, very daft. But maybe what all this does demonstrate is the fact that we all yearn to have something ancient and dramatic in our lives and in our landscape. But the irony, as far as the Australians are concerned, is that they do. Look at all these. These are the marks left by Aborigines over thousands of years. That is the real dramatic, ancient, magical story of Australia. The Australian Aboriginals are custodians of the oldest continuous culture in the world. And it's pretty likely that they're the world's first astronomers too. There are hundreds of stories about the night sky among Aboriginal groups in all parts of Australia. But the stars serve a more practical use too. Every year, directly above this rock engraving, the Emu in the Sky constellation comes into view just when it's time to gather emu eggs. Up in Arnhem Land, the Yolngu people knew when Scorpius appeared, it meant the Macassan fishermen of Indonesia would soon arrive. From the Aboriginal perspective, the idea of a race to the end of the world must seem pretty absurd. They won that race more than 40,000 years before it began. Whether they island hopped or walked across a land bridge from New Guinea is still a matter of debate. The point is, they were here long before anyone else. But who came next? If not the Egyptians, then who was the first non-Aboriginal to discover the Australian coastline? It may well have started with the Chinese. We know that in the Ming dynasty, that's the early 1400s, the emperor had an admiral who was a eunuch, and his name was Zheng He. And Zheng was in charge of a mighty ocean-going fleet, and it's reckoned that he may well have landed in North Australia in the year 1421. It's certainly possible, because he did have a trading post not that far away on the Indonesian islands. That's almost a century before Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. And the ships of Zheng He's fleet completely dwarfed those that the Spanish sailed. But if the Chinese didn't make it to Australia, the Macassans certainly did. For hundreds of years, these hardy fishermen from what's now Indonesia made an annual pilgrimage to the north coast of Australia in search of sea cucumbers. They were regarded as an aphrodisiac back then. The cucumbers, that is, not the sailors. Australia existed in the European imagination long before a European set foot there. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the great unknown southern land. Maps from the time show this vast island continent changing shape as one seafaring nation after another attempted to chart its vast shores. The great Dutch explorer William Jan Zoon sailed around New Guinea in 1606 and bumped into the coast of what today is Cape York. He was probably the first European to land there. Funnily enough, he named the place New Zealand after a flat corner of his Dutch homeland. Of course, the name didn't stick, and we now call the mountainous islands 2,000 kilometres east of Australia, New Zealand. There are lots of examples of sightings and landings on the Australian coast during that time. In fact, between the year 1606 and 1700, there are more than 50 occasions when Europeans landed in Australia. The French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, they all knew it was there. The problem was they didn't know what to do with it. Finally, in the late 17th century, hooray, we get an Englishman on the scene. Was it Captain Cook? No, it wasn't. The first Englishman to arrive on Australia's sandy shores was in 1688. He was a very interesting bloke. He was called William Dampier, and he was an explorer and a collector, very bright man, but he was also extremely dodgy in the mould of Sir Francis Drake. And he and his crew had been hanging around in the Timor Sea for about 3 months in a Spanish ship that they'd nicked called the Signet. And the boat needed repairing, so they thought they would sail south to a land that they vaguely knew existed called New Holland, and they'd land on its northwest shore and make the boat repairable and do a bit of exploring. Dampier wasn't just a pirate, he was a journalist too, and he made lots of notes, which is very useful for us, and he turned them later into a best-selling book. He was deeply unimpressed by Australia. He said it was a dry country, you had to dig wells if you wanted any water, hardly any fish, hardly any animals, the trees didn't have any fruit or berries on them, and as for the people he met, listen to this, it says, the inhabitants of this country are the miserablest people in the world. The Hodmadods of Manamatapa, though a nasty people, yet for wealth a gentleman compared to these. It's interesting, isn't it, that use of the phrase, the Hodmadods of Manamatapa. Sounds a bit like something out of Gulliver's Travels. And in fact, Jonathan Swift wrote that book because he became inspired by Dampier's journey. Dampier's book was called A New Voyage Around the World, and in it he didn't just describe his adventures around the globe, he included a lot of words, over 1,000 of them, which described things that he'd come across on his journeys. And a lot of those words were later incorporated into the English language. Words like albatross, cashew, breadfruit, this one, avocado, and that most iconic of all Australian words, barbecue. Europe was obsessed with exotic spices, and Terra Australis appeared to be a barren and spiceless sort of place. Certainly Dampier thought so. But that was about to change. For centuries, the superpowers of Europe had been battling for colonial supremacy, spreading out across the globe towards Asia. A bit like today, access to the Chinese market was highly prized in the 18th century. And the idea that the unknown land to the south could be a strategic base in the region was catching on. A race began to claim Australia for king and country. Only which king and what country would succeed first? Well, it wasn't a war that decided it. In fact, not a shot was fired. No, it took a once-in-a-generation celestial event to bring the race to a conclusion. In 1769, the planet Venus was due to make a rare transit across the face of the sun. English astronomers wanted to observe it from the South Pacific, and that gave King George III of England an idea. Britain now had an excuse to pursue her imperial ambitions in the South Pacific, and the well-heeled scientists of the Royal Society had the financial clout to back it. So you could say the British might not have claimed Australia had the planets not aligned. This was never going to be a jolly little jaunt across the pond. It was dangerous, cutting-edge science through uncharted waters, as big a deal as a moon landing today. But what no one, apart from the Navy Board, knew was that there was another very secret agenda which wouldn't be revealed until the ship was on the other side of the world. England entered the race to the end of the world, and 39-year-old Lieutenant James Cook was charged with leading the expedition. Already a brilliant cartographer and navigator, Cook was the obvious choice to take the scientists to Tahiti. The Navy Board purchased a little second-hand coal transport called the Earl of Pembroke. Before handing her to Cook, they refitted her and renamed her the Endeavour. Tom, what do you think would have been going through Cook's mind when he set off?
Well, there was the great belief that there had to be a great south land to balance the continents of the Northern Hemisphere. Otherwise, the world would tip. And one of Cook's objectives was to find this great south land. And he didn't quite find it, despite the scale of Australia.
So in a way, it's not unlike our quest for the moon, that part of it's adventure, part of it's this idea that there might be some massive commercial bonus, but there's also science and intellectual inquiry.
Yes, and you don't know what bonus you're going to get.
Cook, the ever-stoic Yorkshireman, never complained about his second-hand coal ship, nor having to share his cabin with a bunch of scientists and their gear. It must have been really crowded on board ship. There were 94 people, including the captain, the crew, the scientists, the artists, the one-armed cook, and last but by no means least, the lucky goat, who was a mascot and considered lucky because she'd already sailed round the globe once, hadn't you? In fact, she became as celebrated as any of the other members of the Endeavour. She was given a pension by the British government. Not only that, but she was voted a member of the Royal Society. Not only the first goat, but also the first female ever to be given that award by such an august body of scientists. What a lucky girl you were. The story of Cook's goat is more than apocryphal. The good captain actually took seriously his responsibility to care for all those in his charge, which was far from common at that time. The biggest scourge for crews in those days was scurvy. Hot dog, please. It was a horrible disease. You got ulcers, your teeth would fall out, your joints would start to ache, your breath would stink, your organs would pack up. Dysentery was a walk in the park compared with scurvy, which in the 1700s could kill up to a third of a ship's crew on long voyages. Thanks a lot, mate. But Cook didn't lose one crew member, and the reason, according to Cook, was this stuff. Sauerkraut. It's hard to imagine that such a disgusting disease is related to a simple vitamin deficiency, but scurvy is caused by a lack of vitamin C. And good old fermented cabbage is full of the stuff. Let's be honest. To a lot of people, sauerkraut doesn't taste that great. And in the early days, anyone who refused their daily portion would be flogged on Cook's orders. At least that was at the beginning. But later on, he practiced a bit of reverse psychology. First, he'd offer the sauerkraut to his officers and petty officers, and then, according to his log, the rest of the crew would look at what was happening and they'd think, oh, if this stuff is worthy of our superiors, it must be the most luxurious food in the world. And they'd scoff it all down. More fool them. The Endeavour in the opposite direction to most previous explorers of the southern seas, who clung to the west coast of Africa before heading eastward across the Indian Ocean. Instead, Cook took the Magellan route across the Atlantic Ocean, down the east coast of South America, around Cape Horn and out into the vast Pacific to locate the tiny island of Tahiti. It took almost 8 months to reach it. But soon after, he turned his mind to the secret mission. You are to proceed in order to make discovery of the continent or land of great extent. There, with the consent of the natives, you will take possession for His Majesty by setting up proper marks and inscriptions as first discoverers and possessors. The hunt for the great southern land was approaching a climax. First, he charted and claimed New Zealand for the crown. Then, on the evening of the 19th of April 1770, Cook knew he was getting close. Seabirds started to appear. It's as though Cook could smell land ahoy. And indeed, at 6 a.m. the next morning, they found it. They'd bumped into nothing less than an island continent. Cook had taken 20 months to guide his overloaded little ship to the end of the world, but they could now lay claim to being the very first Europeans to see the east coast of Australia. Cook and his crew stepped ashore and proclaimed this strange land for England. Although that's actually not quite true, because he actually proclaimed it for George III. But that was mission accomplished, or so you might think. But on board the Endeavour was a brilliant young naturalist called Joseph Banks, and when he stepped ashore, that was just the beginning. Joseph Banks had wealth, influence, and a passion for scientific inquiry, and his money had been critical to the voyage. But even the man himself had not foreseen what an historic and life-changing experience he'd signed up for. Banks first wrote about the people he saw, and he was perplexed. Unlike the friendly Tahitians and hostile Maori, the Australians simply ignored them. They just went on fishing, as though they'd witnessed a white ghost. But Banks is famous for something else. He was blown away by New Holland because for him it was a treasure trove of plant and animal novelty. Botany was his calling, and soon he catalogued more than 1,300 completely new species. But he'd barely scratched the surface. We're incredibly fortunate that Banks employed artists to record what they saw on their journey, most notably Sidney Parkinson, whose luminous pictures are a national treasure. It was almost 2 months before they encountered Australia's most iconic creature, the kangaroo. Cook saw one and he said, "It is just like a greyhound. Indeed, I would have thought it was a wild dog till it started bouncing up and down like a hare." So this being the 18th century, Banks organised a hunt and they shot one, but they didn't stuff it and mount it. They ate it. But then sometime later they managed to get 3 more and they mounted those, took them back to England where they were an overnight sensation. No European had ever seen anything like this before. Well, actually they were wrong, because a century and a half previously a Dutch explorer had brought back a wallaby, but the English didn't care. They discovered Australia and they'd found the very first kangaroo. All right, it's all right, shot's over. You can go and sit down in your chair now. Go on, off you go. Maybe it was because Banks was so obsessed with plants, but they didn't encounter as many of Australia's remarkable creatures as you'd imagine they might. Emus were common along the coast. How could you miss a bird that stands over 2 metres tall? When the first fleet arrived a few years later, they certainly found them soon enough. Governor Arthur Phillip said they tasted like beef. The echidna was described as the most curious and interesting of quadrupeds yet discovered, with a mouth that will not admit anything above the size of a pistol ball. But that was before Europeans laid eyes on the platypus. Following the success of Cook's kangaroo, the platypus was a sensation in Britain, where a craze for all things New Holland had begun. With the beak of a duck grafted onto the head of a quadruped, it soon took the prize for the most extraordinary creature in all mammalia. As for the koala, they couldn't make up their minds whether it was a bear or a monkey. Up you go. And of course, it's neither. As a member of the British aristocracy, Banks' contribution was never going to go unacknowledged. In fact, so esteemed was the aristocratic botanist, there was even a push to name the entire place Banksia. Rather a pretty name for a penal colony. In the late 1700s, Britain was at something of a social crossroads. The Enclosure Acts of the 1760s effectively locked up common lands that had previously been shared with tenant farmers. Farming estates became fenced in by the land-owning elite and populated with sheep. The tenant farmers had to find work in the already overcrowded cities. Now desperate to survive, the poor and unemployed resorted to petty crime.
Middle cut rum. Diet is 2 kilo for $10. There, 2 kilo, $10.
In the 1780s, there was no such thing as a slap on the wrist or a modest fine if you did something wrong. For even petty crimes like stealing a handkerchief, you could get thrown into jail or even hung. The fastest growing class in England was the criminal class. Problem is, there was nowhere left for the government to put them. Transportation to the North American colonies had been the solution to the overflowing prisons of England. But when America finally won its War of Independence in 1782, that put an end to that. Enter Joseph Banks, who'd returned from Australia to instant celebrity. He suggested that Botany Bay would be a suitable alternative for a penal colony. Mild weather, no savage animals, and a small, timid, nomadic native population who would speedily abandon whatever land was needed. The idea of creating a colony in New Holland took shape, and the legal fiction of terra nullius was born. At that time, the British believed Indigenous people only had right to sovereignty over their land if they changed the landscape through agriculture and building. Cook and Banks knew the inhabitants of Australia used fire. Cook actually called it the continent of smoke. But they didn't associate fire with agriculture. So the British decided that New Holland was untouched by mankind, and theirs to claim. The new colony would serve two purposes. It would be a dumping ground for England's unwanted underclass and an outpost of the imperial ambitions of King George III. Claiming the great southern land was one thing. The next great challenge would be establishing a colony on the other side of the planet. When you think about it, moving over 1,400 people to live on the other side of the planet in the 18th century is a bit like packing for a camping trip to the moon. It's a long way back if you forgot the tin opener. The man responsible for this unprecedented effort was Arthur Phillip, a Navy veteran and a brilliant choice as leader. He threw himself at the task, preparing the mass exodus for any eventuality. And he was meticulous in his planning. They took enough food to last 2 years. This included 82 tons of peas, which is about 4 of these containers, 122 tons of pork, 6 containers, and a colossal 288 tons of flour, which is just over 14 of those containers. And Philip was very shrewd. He didn't put all his eggs in one basket. He spread the supplies evenly throughout the fleet, so if one ship went down, he wouldn't lose all his peas, for example. Finally, when he got everything sorted out, he set off. And guess what? He forgot a load of things. He forgot the lime for the building mortar and the cooking tools, and this one was really embarrassing. He forgot the ammunition for the guns, although he kept quiet about that because he didn't want a mutiny. On an overcast morning in May 1787, 11 overladen ships under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip finally pulled out of Portsmouth. Conditions on board the First Fleet were cramped, unhygienic and frankly pretty disgusting. And today we're going to recreate those disgusting conditions with the help of the historically authentic good ship Endeavour and a bunch of tourists. Happy tourists. Convicts, if you wouldn't mind coming up the gangplank, please, and going and standing just over there. Up you come. Don't be shy. You've got a lovely trip in store for you. Hello. 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 Now, you may have noticed there's a little bit of inauthenticity about some of our convicts. The reason, as you've doubtless spotted, is because they don't have the tattoos that so many of the original convicts would have worn. For instance, there was one chap called Simon Gilbert. Simon Gilbert, how do you do? You were a groom who was convicted for stealing a bridle, and you had the words "man in irons." Lucky that's not indelible, isn't it? We've also got Elizabeth Stephen. You had the name of your lover tattooed on a place that could only be seen when you undressed for the surgeon. I'll let you get on with that, all right? Below decks, it was truly appalling. Only a child could stand upright, and the smell must have been incredible. Ankle-deep bilge water coloured with human and animal excrement. Food infested with rats, lice, fleas and cockroaches. But even though it was such a hellhole, romance blossomed. Indeed, it blossomed to such an extent that at least 7 babies were born before the end of the voyage. Well, romance might be a bit of an exaggeration. The surgeon on the Lady Penrhyn, which carried 100 female convicts, wrote that the women regularly plunder the sailors for their clothing and trade their favours for extra rations. It's fair to assume not all the sex was consensual either. What was a terrifying ordeal for the convicts was an adventure of a lifetime for those whose job it was to transport them to Australia. And one of them has left us some buried treasure. It was discovered in a London bookshop in 1923 and now lives here in the State Library of New South Wales. 30-year-old William Bradley was First Lieutenant on the Sirius. He kept a written record of his experiences in the form of a journal, but he did something else that was truly remarkable. His exquisite little watercolours paint a vivid picture of the entire journey and the early days of settlement. You could argue Bradley was Australia's first photojournalist. When the First Fleet set off on the 17th of May 1787, few of its passengers would have been across the Thames, let alone boarded a ship to cross the globe. They stopped at the Cape of Good Hope to take on board the livestock that was so important to creating a colony. More than 500 animals were brought aboard. Bradley describes a scene rather like the loading of Noah's Ark. The passage across the Southern Ocean was treacherous and long. They took sight of Van Diemen's Land, Phillip had implemented a ration system as food supplies ran critically low. Many animals were near to starvation. After 8 months of sailing, Botany Bay came into view. Bradley's watercolour of the arrival is a triumphant image. But it turned out to be the biggest anticlimax in Australian history. This place, Botany Bay, was a big disappointment. Cook and Banks had talked up its assets, but the First Fleet found it windblown and swampy. The soil was sandy, the water was brackish, and the wood was so hard it was virtually impossible to cut down the trees. This was definitely not the place to build a colony if you wanted it to survive. One of the other officers wrote, "If we are obliged to settle here, there'll not be a soul alive in the course of a year." But Phillip wasn't about to contradict the illustrious Captain Cook and Joseph Banks. He sent work parties ashore to find a location for the settlement. He must have had his doubts, though. After 4 days, he set off north with 3 small rowing boats to examine the place marked as Port Jackson on Cook's map. What he found truly astonished him. Phillip had stumbled on perhaps the finest harbour in the world. What puzzles me is why Cook stayed stuck down in Botany Bay and missed this fantastic harbour.
Well, Australia's so different in terms of flora and fauna from anywhere else. Sir Joseph Banks, the lofty young naturalist that was with him, discovered so many new species that's why he called it Botany Bay. And when they sailed up the coast here, past these heads, they would have thought that this was the extent of it, this little indentation in the coast. He didn't know that running away to the south was one of the great harbours on the face of the earth. And that's how it happened.
I bet, though, flashing through Philip's head was the thought, what an idiot, when he came here and saw what there was.
Well, he was very cranky at Cook's reports of Botany Bay, which proved unsuitable for a penal colony or a settlement of any kind.
Philip now had an agonising decision to make. His orders were to establish a colony at Botany Bay. But suddenly his decision was made for him. He just arrived back in Botany Bay when one of his sailors shouted, "Another sail!" There on the horizon was the most extraordinary and unexpected sight. The French explorer La Perouse had dropped in for an unexpected visit. Philip knew him because years earlier he'd been spying on the Frenchman. Now it appeared the tables were turned. La Perouse had been bobbing up and down in the Pacific for the previous 3 years or so, mapping Korea, rounding Cape Horn, discovering the odd island or two. He knew that Philip had been ordered to bring a few settlers out here, and quite frankly, he was pretty surprised that the colony wasn't more developed. He could hardly see any houses or anything, really. As far as Philip was concerned, he'd got no idea what La Perouse was doing here. Was he spying? Did he want to set up a French colony? Whatever it was, it surely wasn't a coincidence. It was a complete mystery. He had to act fast. What if the Frenchman found the wonderful new harbour? He took off for Port Jackson with orders for the rest of the fleet to follow him as soon as possible. He had to claim it for England. There then followed what I think is one of the most bizarre moments in British colonial history. Imagine if Neil Armstrong had popped out of his Apollo spacecraft, walked round the crater and discovered the Russians. This was that kind of moment. So did the French and the English shake hands, fling their arms round one another and row to the shore for a party? No. The First Fleet sailed out of Botany Bay, La Perouse sailed into Botany Bay, and they barely had time to exchange the most cursory of civilities. The French line was that La Perouse was simply looking for a safe harbour to resupply. He only stayed 6 weeks. His 2 ships and all aboard mysteriously disappearing soon after, somewhere in the Pacific. A tragic end to an incredible journey of discovery. And who knows, if the winds had been a bit fairer and if La Perouse had turned up a bit earlier, then the whole of Australian history might have been profoundly changed, and Australians today would all be speaking French and eating coq au vin rather than pies and sauce. Cheers. In late January 1788, the last of the 11 ships of the First Fleet pulled anchor in Botany Bay to sail the short distance to Port Jackson. Captain Phillip sailed 11 kilometres up into the harbour till he came to this little inlet, which he took quite a shine to. He liked the cover it provided. It was pretty flat around here, there was good anchorage, looked like you'd be able to cultivate stuff here. It was less marshy than Botany Bay, and you could pick up a kebab here. Actually, you couldn't in those days. But the real reason for starting the new colony here in Sydney rather than anywhere else doesn't have a big tourist sign over it saying this is the reason that Sydney got started. It's much more obscure than that. In fact, it's right underground. The most important consideration when you're establishing any new colony has got to be a fresh water supply. So Paris has got the gorgeous River Seine, and London's got Old Father Thames, and Sydney's foundation waterway is slightly less romantic. And helping me explore it is archaeologist Wayne Johnson. Thank you. So this is the mighty river that caused Sydney to come into existence?
Yep, this trickle of water was all they really had to go by.
But it's tiny.
Well, when Governor Phillip got to Botany Bay and found there wasn't much going down there, they came up to Sydney Cove, and this was the closest thing they could find to a decent water supply.
But it's underground now, whereas presumably it was on the surface originally.
The tank stream is a valley, and the water poured into the middle, and if you look at the contours of Sydney today, you can see it's sloping down. But when the whole thing was turned into a drain, then it became buried, and Sydney sort of grew up around it.
When was it covered up?
Well, after a while, people were doing their washing in it. It's being used as a bit of an open sewer, much like Fleet Street or the old Fleet sewer was in London. And so it was decided in the 1850s to put it all underground.
It's not exactly the Hudson River or the mighty Mississippi, is it?
No, it's not, but it's pretty well all we've got to form a colony.
This line is all that's left of the tank stream above ground today, but it's not the only mark that is left on the city. Shortly after the first fleet arrived, it became an unofficial class divide. On the east of the tank stream lived the officers and the governors, because the sea breezes blew all the bad smells away, and on the west lived the soldiers and the convicts. And that divide still exists today. On the east side, where all the swanky buildings and the rich people live, and on the west, well, that's for the working classes. Dropped anchor in what's now known as Circular Quay on a perfect summer day in 1788, he called it Sydney Cove, after Lord Sydney, the British Home Secretary, whose brilliant idea it was to set up a colony in windswept and swampy Botany Bay. More than 200 years on, the diverse Australian community celebrates this bumbling start as the birth of nationhood. The day was January the 26th, the day the nation was born. Even today, it's still celebrated as Australia Day, a day of great civic pride throughout the country. Except, of course, that for the original inhabitants, it was a complete disaster, and many of them still view it as a day of mourning. But I can't help wondering whether the words of previous generations of sailors who'd visited these shores and declared it uninhabitable and of no economic worth whatsoever would still have been ringing in Captain Phillip's ears when he first plunged his Union Jack into Australian soil. He'd been given an impossible task, a task that lesser men and women than the convicts and Marines he'd brought with him surely wouldn't have survived. Britain had won the race to the end of the world, but the real battle was just beginning. Next time, I'm going to explore the tough early years of the colony. So Freeman does the deed, Parrot's dead. And reveal the sordid and salacious secrets of the First Fleet's first night in Australia. If you attempt to get into the women's tents of a night, you will be fired upon.
There is no doubt, Tony, I'm afraid it was a serious orgy.
You've got to watch that. Sydney's Royal Botanic Gardens are just around the corner from where the 11 ships of Captain Arthur Phillip's First Fleet dropped anchor in the summer of 1788. The fleet was moored just behind where the Sydney Opera House is now, and the very first people to be sent ashore were the male convicts. They were tasked with clearing all the trees and putting up the tents and digging the latrines. In other words, in creating the beginnings of the very first colony. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to recreate that first colony with the help of Tim Flannery, eminent author and historian. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Tony. Great to meet you.
And also some passers-by. If you wouldn't mind moving all this stuff, setting up the colony over there, OK? Presumably it would have been a lovely sunny day when the first colony was being built.
Well, there was storms on the horizon, I think, because we know that later that evening all hell broke loose.
When you say all hell, what kind of hell?
One of those thunderstorms that only a place like Sydney can put on. It just feels like the end of the world. Lightning, thunder, rain that you can hardly see through.
It does seem a bit mad to have let the men off the ship and then wait 11 days till the women were allowed out.
Well, look, the women were terribly troublesome. They were so difficult to handle that the sailors were given an extra ration of rum when they were let off. So yeah. I guess they had to have things sorted out before they let them free. A great bolt of lightning came down, hit the sentry on duty, blinded him, killed 5 of the colony's sheep, and of course all of the people in authority were basically carrying on the ships offshore, and the sailors came ashore, and what are we going to do with the extra rum? I know what, let's go into the women's tents. So the scene that was developing here and was observed between the flashes of lightning were drunken sailors, drunken women, doing who knows what in the mud and having a great party, basically.
Do you think there really was an orgy, or do you think that's a bit of a gloss that storytellers added later on?
There is no doubt, Tony, I'm afraid it was a serious orgy. You've just got to read Ralph Clark's words, Lieutenant Ralph Clark, who he said, you know, what a scene of whoredom is there ashore, that presumably he'd watched between the lightning bolts, people rutting in the mud and who knows what.
What I find so extraordinary is that you've got this incredible 21st century city now, and yet it all started with a bit of this. OK, you lot over there, start shagging. That was the beginning of Sydney, and it hasn't looked back since. The new colony certainly started with a bang, and while everyone was shocked, no one was surprised. Least of all British Marine Watkin Tench, who wrote, "What was to be attempted? To prevent their intercourse was impossible, and to palliate its evils only remained. Marriage was recommended." The next morning, Governor Phillip gathered all the fleet together. Officers, soldiers, sailors and convicts. The Navy man knew his authority had been compromised. In foul temper, he seized it back. I'm now thoroughly convinced that nothing but severity will have any effect upon you to induce you to behave properly in the future. If you attempt to get into the women's tents of a night, you will be fired upon. In England, thieving poultry isn't punished with death, but here, where a loss of that kind cannot be replaced, it is of the utmost consequence to the settlement. Therefore, stealing the most trifling article of stock or provisions shall be punished with death. You miserable bastards. The governor made it perfectly clear that the new colony would be no picnic on the beach. But if his admonishment wasn't enough, the colony's top legal beak also had something to say. The hungover colonists are told they'll hear a statement from their king. And then Captain Collins, who was going to be the new judge advocate, read from this thing, which was called the Commission. And as you can see, they were incredibly long, and it said stuff like, "With these, our instructions, you will receive our commission under our Great Seal. We're appointing you to be our Captain General and Governor-in-Chief of our territory, extending from the northern cape or extremity of the coast called Cape York," blah, 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 for over an hour. And when he'd finished, that kicked off one of the biggest land grabs in the history of the British Empire. The British Crown had just claimed for itself more than 4 million square kilometres of New Holland, and the colony of New South Wales was born. The occasion was light on pageantry, but heavy with meaning. A fact that would probably have been lost on the convicts and the members of the Cadigal tribe watching bemused from a distance. What do you think the Aboriginals were really thinking when the Europeans arrived?
Obviously, there was a language barrier, so we couldn't ask them outright, are you here to stay, or how long are you staying for, when are you leaving? So when the township of Sydney started to grow, I believe that was a real clue for Aboriginal people that they're not leaving anytime soon.
Tension between the two groups started pretty quickly, didn't it, when it became obvious they were competing for food?
Yeah, definitely. When the early colony first started to understand how Aboriginal people would use this food, they started to watch and copy and then start to eat all of the food. And then Aboriginal people were thinking, well, we've always made sure that there was enough for tomorrow, and you're just catching everything and eating it all. So that would have caused some animosity between the two camps for sure.
It was soon clear that these pale strangers weren't passing through. They were taking fish from the harbour, tearing up the environment, building solid huts. And this was just the beginning. From day one, the new colony was operating on borrowed time. Governor Phillip had only brought enough food to last 2 years, and there wasn't a decent farmer among them. Things only got worse when a drought hit in 1789. Here at Vaucluse House in Sydney, they now grow the crops of those early years with a lot of success. Jackie Newling's an expert on how they fed themselves in those early days.
You had a great labour force, 700 odd people, but they didn't have skilled farmers.
Why not?
Well, most of the convicts were urban crims. They hadn't had any connection with the land in their past. So there was a great void, if you like, in skill.
It seems like it was a big tactical mistake for the First Fleet not to bring out farmers.
It does rather. They arrived in summer, so of course that was the hottest time of the year, so a lot of the crops they first planted couldn't survive that heat, and there were several droughts over those first 5 years, actually. They felt they were starving.
Food was rationed, and the rations were meagre. But incredibly, Arthur Phillip decreed that equal amounts be given to officers and convicts alike. Hunger was blind in the eyes of the new governor.
That was a real thing for Phillip. He believed in parity. The only difference was the Marines got a tot of rum each day, which the convicts weren't allowed.
Why did they go to such an extent as to implement a ration system? It's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. First of all, it's a finite amount of food and you had to make it last. But it actually served a second purpose. As well as being food, it was a way of keeping check of your people. They had to be tied to the settlement for their food.
This is food as social control?
Absolutely. It was a type of mustering. In a jail without walls, if you controlled the food, then they had to stay within the settlement.
And this is what they got. Flour, salted pork, split peas, butter and rice. No fruit, barely a vegetable. It looks fine, doesn't it? Enough bulk for you to survive, but it doesn't look very interesting.
Well, it's actually surprising what you can make from this selection of ingredients. Got some samples up here if you like. Obviously, bread is your obvious one for flour, and the convicts were invited to hand their ration of flour into the central baker, and he would give them an equivalent weight loaf of bread.
What's this?
This is what we came to be known as a Johnny cake, sort of a homemade bread that you just make in hot coals.
Oh, it's a bit of a wrestle breaking a bit of this off.
Are you criticising my cooking?
No, I'm not. That's not bad at all, is it?
It's not too bad, and it's quite dense.
You're
and
telling
again,
me.
But again, good energy. This is sort of like your one-pot meal, a stew, flavoured by the meat and with whatever greens you could lay your hands on, and little dumplings, again, made out of your flour ration.
Well, it's very salty, isn't it? Looks like a bit of a mistake. Phillip had a crisis on his hands.
Well, this is it.
The crops were failing, the weather was harsh and unpredictable. And with no fresh food or vegetables, diseases started to break out, scurvy and leg ulcers. 1789 came and went, and still no supply ship. 1790 arrived, by which time everyone had fallen into depression at the prospect of a slow starvation. And if ever there was a clap of thunder or a weapon was fired, everyone would shout, "Gun from a ship, gun from a ship," and they'd all race to the cliff edge and scour the horizon. But of course, it never was a ship, until at last, on the 1st of April 1790, Phillip was forced to cut the rations even more. The good news was you got more rice. The bad news was all the peas went, 2/3 of the flour went, all the butter, and that much meat. There wasn't much left. Foraging for food in the bush was a dangerous undertaking for the unarmed convicts. And stealing from the government store carried the death penalty. But hunger is a powerful motivator. Just a month after settlement, the convicted conman and forger Thomas Parrot was caught stealing provisions. That same afternoon, Parrot was marched down this very hill by the Marine garrison to his place of execution. The entire convict population had been ordered to gather on this street corner to witness this public demonstration of the folly of stealing food. The hangman was a young bloke called James Freeman, who'd also been sentenced to death for stealing food, but in his case, Phillip had pardoned him, provided he was prepared to become the colony hangman. And James agreed. Must have seemed like quite a good deal, except he didn't really want to be a hangman because he thought it would make all the other convicts hate him. Can't think why, but he did. So when it came to hanging Parrot, he wanted a stall, so he's fiddling around and generally wasting time, taking minute after minute after minute, till eventually Major Ross, who's the head of the Marines, threatens to shoot him dead unless he gets on with it. So suddenly James speeds up. Well, up until that moment, Parrot had been pretty relaxed because he thought he was going to be getting some kind of last-minute reprieve. Suddenly, he realises that that isn't going to happen, and he's terrified. So Freeman does the deed, Parrot's dead. The whole thing was a complete farce. I wonder what it says about a country where the first man hanged was also the creator of the colony's first work of art. While still on the ship that transported him from England, Parrot produced this exquisite little engraving, now known as the Charlotte Medal. He's said to have made it from the surgeon's kidney dish. On one side is an image of the Charlotte, on the other, an account of the long journey from Mother England to the far side of the world. It's a national treasure now, all the more so because the man who made it, like so many Australian folk heroes, found death at the hands of the authorities. But unruly convicts weren't Captain Phillip's only problem. He arrived with explicit orders to build relations with the natives of New Holland, who'd been described to him as timid and nomadic. But the Aborigines were avoiding the settlement and attacking anyone who strayed from it. The governor had to find ways to turn things around. But in order to do this, he did something which to an 18th century British imperialist might have seemed very sensible, but to us seems at best bizarrely unacceptable and at worst a criminal offence. He identified a likely-looking Aboriginal and kidnapped him. His name was Arabanoo, and on New Year's Eve 1788, he was snatched from his tribe's territory in Manly and brought to the settlement in chains. The following day, Arabanoo shared lunch with the colonial dignitaries at Government House, except the guest of honour was chained at the feet to prevent him from escaping. Imagine what the experience would have been like for him. Everything in the entire room would have been alien, including the knife and fork and the china service, virtually the only one in the entire colony, which was put in front of him. He was even offered a glass of wine. which he thought was absolutely disgusting, and declined. But like a lot of Aboriginals, he was a very good mimic and pretty quick on the uptake. So he managed to get through the entire meal without mishap, including the toast to the king, which he did with his glass of water. Phillip felt quite satisfied with his first experiment in socialisation, but he couldn't have grasped how very differently his guest Arabanoo saw the world. When he'd finished eating, like any Aboriginal who'd used a plate made out of a leaf or a bit of bark or something, he picked up his plate and started to throw it out of the window until he was grabbed by some of the guests and prevented from doing so. Imagine the feeling of amusement and consternation and slightly implied threat that the assembled multitude must have felt. There was curiosity and quite a bit of goodwill between the two groups in these early days, but a tragedy was about to unfold that would change that profoundly. Arabanoo, the Aboriginal man captured by Captain Phillip, lived at the governor's house for almost 6 months. Although the majority of that time he remained in irons. What do you reckon Arabanoo felt about all this?
Oh boy, that is the million-dollar question. I can't really get into the man's mind because he was kidnapped, which is obviously a violent thing to happen to him, but then was brought in and treated with great kindness by these strange beings. There was a belief among Aboriginal people that the Europeans were ancestors who'd come back, and perhaps he thought he was among his ancestors. We don't know.
For the first year of settlement, there was more curiosity than hostility between the Aborigines and the new tribe from Britain, as can be seen in this painting by Lieutenant Bradley, which captures them dancing together. But 18 months in, quite suddenly, the Aborigines began to die, not by the musket, but by something even more devastating: smallpox. You said that smallpox took Arabanoo. Was that something that was known on the Australian continent before the Europeans arrived?
Probably the greatest mystery of early Australian history is where this smallpox came from, and there's a number of alternative theories. One is that perhaps Indonesians brought it into northern Australia and it had been working its way down and just happened to break out when the first fleet arrived. Another one was that it was aboard the French fleets because there was a French expedition that met the first fleet in Botany Bay at the time it arrived. But none of them make sense much because the smallpox breaks out after 18 months. So where was it all of that time? But once it broke out, it spread like wildfire.
The beaches were strewn with the dead and dying, and no one had an answer for how it got into the population. The First Fleet surgeon, John White, brought with him a piece of material imbued with a smallpox sample. It was locked away for the purposes of inoculation. Could it have been tampered with? Do you reckon this was done deliberately?
Oh, absolutely not. It's clear from the reaction of everyone from Governor Phillip down and the surgeon and others. They came around to caves like this all around the harbour, finding dead and dying Aboriginal people in them, and did their very best to help them. And in fact, they brought Aboriginal children who were suffering from smallpox back to the settlement and fed them and looked after them. And so I don't think it was deliberate at all. It was a great tragedy. Australian history is this strange paradox. Often people see it as a war between black and white and the conquest of a continent, and that's true at some levels, but there were deep friendships built, and there was, in the earliest days, I think, mutual respect.
I can't help feeling a bit sorry for Governor Phillip in a strange sort of way. Not only did he attempt to bridge the enormous cultural abyss that existed between the Aboriginals and the Europeans in a really heavy-handed way and failed entirely, but 18 months later, all the Aboriginal population around here was decimated by a disease that may well have been brought in by Phillip's men. Not a great start to a new colony. But Phillip was nothing if not persistent. He kidnapped 2 more Aboriginal men, Benelong and Colby. And you could say it was a success of sorts. As odd as it seems, Benelong and the governor did develop a friendship. Benelong learned English and called Phillip father. But Governor Phillip was less successful at controlling the behaviour of the convicts and Marines. The list of grievances committed against the original inhabitants was growing daily. One day, without any warning, Benelong disappeared, and Phillip was said to be devastated. So when Benelong sent a message to Phillip asking him to meet at a beach across the harbour, he set off without hesitation. What occurred next, right here in Manly Cove, is one of the defining events in early colonial history. OK, so there was Phillip on the beach.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Well, he saw his friend Benelong.
Yeah.
Tried to greet him. Benelong thought that he'd give him a bit of whale meat. There was a beached whale here.
Yeah.
And that was always a bounty for the Eora-speaking people.
Yeah.
But Benelong was evasive, and Phillip noticed a man he'd never met before, an Aboriginal from up in the Botany Bay area, standing up here, further on the beach.
What was the other guy's name?
Willemering.
Willemering, yeah, so he's over here. And what's his demeanour?
His demeanour is not evasive, it's grim. And so Phillip, being a curious Enlightenment man, comes up and tries to reassure him.
Yeah.
He thinks the man is suffering from the first contact trauma.
Yeah.
And the man is aggressive, steps back, and drives the spear through his shoulder.
I don't think you'd have been laughing quite this much. What happened to him?
Phillip immediately staggers, of course. The men think that there is a massacre on. They're very worried. They got him back to the boat.
Yeah.
With this in him.
Still in him?
Yeah.
All right, yeah.
It had gone through. They had to row him way up the harbour to Sydney, 7 miles. And up there, he said, no retaliation. I don't want anything done. The shaft was taken out by a less than brilliant surgeon named Balmain, after whom a Sydney suburb is named. And Phillip, through that ordeal, still kept saying no retaliation.
Phillip could be forgiven for thinking he'd survived an attempted assassination, but somehow he understood that he was being sent a message. Phillip recovered and sent his men to find Benelong to show there were no hard feelings. Eventually, a meeting was arranged, and Phillip in his boat met Benelong in his canoe on the harbour. Soon after, Benelong and his family moved to Sydney and occupied a small stone hut on the point where the Opera House now stands. It's been known as Benelong Point ever since. Phillip's original intention to develop friendly relations with the locals seemed to be finally coming to fruition. Other Aborigines from round the harbour became regular visitors to the camp. But sadly, this promising period wasn't to last. There was tension in the air, and one incident would combust into guerrilla warfare. The convict John McIntyre was gamekeeper for Phillip and his officers. Food was scarce, and his ability to shoot native animals for their table made him a popular and valuable member of the colony. But he relied heavily on Aboriginal hunters, including one man in particular called Pemulwuy. He was a great hunter, respected by everyone who knew him. But there were those like McIntyre who were wary of the powerfully built Aboriginal, and perhaps with good reason. In time, Pemulwuy would become Australia's first guerrilla leader. So if Pemulwuy was offering them food from the bush, then McIntyre had to deal with him.
He certainly did. If not him, then someone else. And the idea of someone else grew, I think, in McIntyre's mind. And eventually, I think McIntyre decided to kill him. After all, this was the beginning of the age of Terra Nullius. Pemulwuy wasn't really human in the British sense, but he was a very dangerous man. So McIntyre knew this. He had to be pretty clever in doing this. And McIntyre said, well, look, so let's talk about this. You put down your weapon, I'll put down mine. Macarthur came out to talk to him with a bunch of armed New South Wales Corps with him. And Macarthur took his pistol, cocked it, put it on the ground, and Pemulwuy threw down his spear. And no sooner the spear hit the ground, when you could imagine these two looking at each other. It was like the ultimate metaphor, you know, the known and the unknown looking at each other. The particular weapon that Pemulwuy used was a weapon designed for homicide. It had all sorts of barbs on it, and these things usually kill people. And Macarthur dived down and grabbed the pistol. Pemulwuy flicked the spear up into his hand and threw it. By the time the pistol went off, he'd been hit by Pemulwuy's spear. So it happened pretty quick. Macarthur died. Phillip sent out a huge military expedition after him. When I say huge, it was about 50 or 60 men, but in those days, 50 or 60 armed men, I think there was something like 40 privates involved. They had drummers, they had a surgeon, so it was substantial.
And it was war, you think?
I think it was war, and I think that was the act of war. When Pemulwuy struck Macarthur with that spear.
So once the war had been sparked, how did it operate?
Well, then Pemulwuy's people started to attack the settlers. And I think Pemulwuy always wanted to do that in any case. I mean, the British were armed with firearms, muskets. Pemulwuy's people were armed with spears and shields and boomerangs, etc. Then you'd wonder how they could stand up to each other for any length of time. But they weren't the real weapons. The real weapons were the ones you didn't see. For Pemulwuy, they were fire. Pemulwuy used fire then as a weapon. He used it now to prevent the British growing grain, particularly. And it was the wheat fields that he attacked. And the British responded. The British knew what he was about. They responded by creating what they call the grain patrols. There were skirmishes of various sorts between them, and they were pretty serious casualties. I mean, there were hundreds of people were killed in this war.
On both sides?
On both sides. And keep in mind, there wasn't that many people here at the time.
Pemulwuy led as many as 100 fighters, including some escaped Irish convicts. This was organised, strategic guerrilla warfare that lasted 12 years. Pemulwuy was reportedly shot several times, but fought on. It took a bounty hunter to finally bring him down in 1802. The fact that the Aboriginals organised an uprising against the British colonists and that it lasted 12 years is just a footnote in most histories of Australia, as is the fact that his head was removed from its body, pickled, sent to England, and was kept in the British Museum until it was lost. But there's an interesting twist to this story. Just recently, the grandson of the present British monarch, Prince William, has been enlisted to try and find Pemulwuy's head and return it to Australia. I hope he's successful. With the death of Pemulwuy, the resistance eventually lost its direction. Progress and development were now irresistible. For the early convicts, this meant enormous changes were on the way. Despite the rocky start, the penal colony eventually got on its feet. When Charles Darwin, the world's most famous naturalist, visited the colony in the early 1800s, he said, "As a place of punishment, the object is scarcely gained. But as a means of converting vagabonds most useless in one hemisphere into active citizens of another, and this giving birth to a new and splendid country, it has succeeded to a degree perhaps unparalleled in history." By the turn of the century, starvation was quelled, as was the Aboriginal uprising. And as more and more convicts completed their sentences, some decided to make a go of it as free men and women. Sydney today isn't recognisable from the early settlement. but the clues to life in the early 1800s are still there. All you have to do is dig them up. Ironically, some of the oldest finds are buried underneath a youth hostel. This is a great place to stay, particularly if you like archaeology, because all you have to do is get up, take a few deep breaths, and here it is right outside Australia's biggest ever archaeological dig. This amazing site has been responsible for smashing more than a few myths about the way convicts lived in the early days. You have had some gorgeous finds out of this place, haven't you?
We've had a lot of material from the 18th and 19th century which has turned up from this site. Almost 1 million objects, in fact.
What's that?
This piece here is probably an anchovy paste bottle, but it has a scene from the Battle of Balaclava, the charge of the Light Brigade. So it would have been a common sort of a theme that people would have liked and had on their tables and reminded them of events in Britain. A couple of 100,000 bones have been found on the site. So this half of the archaeological site was where George Cribb had his butchering process.
And George Cribb was?
George Cribb's one of the heroes of the site. He was a convict. By his occupation, he was a butcher. Just yesterday, we uncovered this platform here. We think that perhaps this might have been where they brought in the cows and slaughtered them.
So this was a man who started off as a convict, and in a very little time he was running his own business.
Yeah, well, he's a really interesting character. Firstly, we can take the legitimate side, and that was that he's running his butcher practice here. Within 2 or 3 months, he's advertising meat for sale to ships going back to Britain or going off whaling or whatever. But on the illegal side, we know that he was picked up on 2 occasions for dealing with illegally distilled alcohol, so running a still. And on each occasion, he managed to escape the law. So there was a suspicion there, but they never managed to actually sort of find any evidence.
But you have?
But we have. Because when we were excavating the backyard of George's butcher shop, we found a well, and it included a small still. So it would have been used for distilling small amounts of alcohol. It was buried around about 1818, which coincides with the time that George managed to get a legitimate pub licence, and he built his pub, the Turk's Head, next door to where this was found.
You caught him red-handed.
Well, except it was about 170, 180 years too late, but you know, it sort of gives a bit of an insight.
This is extraordinary to me. You've got convicts who have got country estates, they've got racehorses, they're running pubs, they're rentier landlords. Not such a bad life.
No, well, George even built a row of tenements in the back of the property, just behind where we're standing, which he rented out to other convicts. I mean, being a convict was like being a public servant most of the time, and didn't really feel like a prison. It was a free society, but the sentence was that you had to be in this place. The ability to make a new life is just phenomenal.
This was George's little empire. This was his house, here was his shop, here was his hotel, the Turk's Head. Behind him, he had a run of tenement houses. He had a well over there. This was a seriously successful businessman. In fact, he was so successful that he wrote to his nephew in Wiltshire and persuaded his nephew to do exactly the same thing that George had done, commit a felony, get convicted, get transported to Australia, and there he joined his uncle. But then things started to go wrong because the nephew immediately had a very public affair with George's wife, which was, of course, a great humiliation. And after that, George lost his house and his shop and his hotel and his butchery, even his racehorses, and became a bankrupt. After that, he disappears from the pages of history into obscurity. With talent and ambition were vital to the transformation of the colony from a shambolic tent city to a viable going concern. This very beautiful and very, very English church, St James's, started life as a courthouse, took 5 years to complete, it was finished in 1824, and that spire used to be a landmark for approaching ships. But what I find really intriguing about it is that the architect was a convict. In fact, Australia's first convict architect, Francis Greenway. Greenway had been an architect in England, but went bankrupt. It's been suggested that Greenway committed fraud to get a free passage to Australia, but that's a pretty high-risk strategy given that he was initially sentenced to death. We do know that he saw himself as a gentleman convict, as you can see in this tableau of his life in prison, which he painted during transportation to the colony. And he came with a letter of recommendation from none other than Arthur Phillip. Within a decade, he was the colony's most eminent architect. In fact, so much so that over 100 years later, his work was celebrated in the new Australian $10 bill. That is the only face of a convicted forger ever to appear on a banknote, and it's Francis Greenway. And he wasn't alone. Down in Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, one convict even became a media mogul who created Hobart's biggest daily newspaper. His name was John Davies. He was transported from England in 1831, still a teenager, for the slightly ludicrous crime of purchasing a candle on another man's account. You are the great-great-granddaughter of a thief and a rogue and a convict, aren't you?
I am.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm quite proud of him. I'm quite proud of him. He was all of those things, but he rose above it and made a really good life for himself in Australia.
Why was he sent here in the first place?
Well, he actually came out under the assisted passage scheme for fraud.
You mean he was transported?
He was transported, yes.
It is extraordinary how he rocketed up the administrative ladder when he got here.
He certainly did. He moved from being a ticket of leave man to a chief constable to a newspaper reporter and then finally a newspaper proprietor.
John Davies went on to create one of Australia's greatest media dynasties. But to his dying day, he remained ashamed of his convict roots and went to extraordinary lengths to hide his past. So you've got this incredibly successful man, and yet when he died, his obituary was full of the most ridiculous spin, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Do you think he wrote it before he died?
I think he probably did. Tell us the kind of things that it said.
He had supposedly worked on the Manchester Guardian in Britain. He had come to Australia via India, where he'd worked on the Englishman in Calcutta. He'd been on one of the first expeditions to Afghanistan. He'd been shipwrecked in Bass Strait on King Island and had to swim for his life, and then finally arrived in Hobart, all complete and utter fabrication.
His dad worked in newspapers when he got to Australia. He did, his kids did. The paper was in your family till the 1970s. You are the Murdochs of Tasmania, aren't you?
That's right, and now Murdoch owns it. So it's
you're joking?
No.
So another great newspaper family has taken over from you. It's a dog-eat-dog world in publishing, isn't it?
That's right, yes.
It's incredible to me that the convicts were in many cases more respectable than the people who were sent to guard them. The Redcoats, better known as the Rum Corps, were charged with upholding the law. But they weren't known for abiding by it. Some of them became rich beyond their wildest dreams. What a weird place New South Wales was in the early 1800s. Emancipated convicts, who a few years before were living in poverty on the streets of London, were getting rich. But it wasn't just the convicts who made the most of the opportunities that the new colony gave them. The people who looked after them, or were supposed to, the soldiers, they could rise and rise and rise. And it didn't seem to matter if they were argumentative and dysfunctional and generally stroppy. That could be an absolute advantage to them. It certainly was in the case of John MacArthur, who'd arrived in the settlement in 1790 as a penniless lieutenant, but then because of land deals and because of his trade, he dealt in rum apart from anything else, made a lot of money. But he was incredibly stroppy. If he didn't like someone, he would want to fight them. He would have duels with them. In fact, one particular duel that he became involved in was really significant. It not only changed Australia's history, but it changed its landscape forever. Stephen, what was the issue that this duel was around?
That's a good question, Tony. I think historians have been trying to understand John Macarthur's mindset for generations. Macarthur exposed some letters that put his commanding officer of the New South Wales Corps, Colonel Patterson's wife, in a bad light, and Colonel Patterson was offended. Now, for Colonel Patterson, that breaks the code of gentlemanly conduct. So he challenges Macarthur to a duel.
What were the rules of these kinds of duels?
Well, the rules were codified in the 1770s.
Yeah.
But they were often changed. For example, in this duel with Macarthur and Patterson, there was a toss of a coin.
What was the coin tossing all about?
If you won the toss, you fired first.
You fired first?
That's right.
I thought duels were supposed to be 12 paces, you take out your guns and you shoot each other.
Well, normally, that's correct. Someone would drop a handkerchief or make a signal and you would both present and fire. However, there were certain variations, and we don't know why this was chosen.
Time for the guns. So we just pick one?
Take one.
I'll be Patterson, all right?
You're Patterson.
OK.
Shall we toss a coin?
Oh, all right, yeah, we have to toss the coin first.
Heads.
Heads it is.
I win. I get to shoot you.
Great.
Unless I miss, and then it's your right to return fire.
Right.
Now, I shall mark out 12 paces.
How do I stand?
Stand as side on as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And your arm behind your back.
Yeah.
Make yourself less of a target. And I shall raise my pistol and fire first.
And you just get to fire at me? Wait for it. All right, carry on.
The surgeon would come in and determine whether the duel was over or whether you could, in fact, continue firing. But Surgeon Harris was the attendant surgeon, and he decided Patterson could not carry on. It took a while for Patterson's life to be stabilised. He was seriously wounded. So that was the end of the duel.
But it wasn't actually Patterson that Macarthur was after, was it?
No, it was Governor King.
So what was his reaction?
Governor King then investigated the duel, obviously. Now, duelling was illegal in the army, but if it went through a certain court process, legal process, and analysed, then people wouldn't be charged with murder necessarily. But he had trouble investigating Macarthur, so he decided that he would send him back to England on a court-martial, as it was against army rules.
And, of course, the irony was that that court-martial could have been the end of Macarthur, but it was the making of the man.
Exactly.
A lot of people must have thought it was a good idea to rid the colony of the troublesome lieutenant, but Macarthur's good luck didn't end with the duel. When he got to England, his court-martial was quashed, so he was a free man. And he went round telling everyone that Australia could be Britain's next wool provider, because it was the Napoleonic Wars at that time, and Britain had lost its usual supply of wool from Spain. And one of the people who heard him was a senior government minister called Lord Camden, who arranged for Macarthur to be given a land grant of a massive 5,000 acres of prime land in New South Wales, on which he could raise sheep. And all of this is the land that Macarthur was granted. And his luck didn't end there. On the boat out to England, he'd met the son of the Prince of Wales's doctor, which is a pretty obscure royal connection, I know, but he'd used it to have a look at the king's sheep. In fact, he actually managed to bring a few of them back to Australia, and they were the best wool producers in England and perfectly suited to Australian conditions. And these are the direct descendants of those royal sheep. Am I supposed to kneel or something? This stuff as well as a workforce of ex-convicts, not only transformed a poor, lowly, hot-tempered lieutenant into the richest man in Australia by far, but it also turned the fledgling colony into a rich nation whose wealth and good fortune rode on the sheep's back. For over a century, Australia has been the largest wool producer on the planet. Phillip, the first governor of New South Wales, returned to England in poor health after just 5 years running the colony. Every record shows he was a committed and compassionate man who was often frustrated with the challenges he faced. It's easy to imagine that he went home with what today we'd call stress leave. But in the decades that followed, the colony fared better than he could have imagined. In just a few generations, it went from terra incognita, whose coastline was unknown, to one of Mother England's most highly valued assets, a transformation unparalleled in the history of the world. And the best was yet to come. Next time, I'm going to explore the first rumblings of dissent in the colony as the convicts find voice and rise up. Fire at him! You're firing at him. OK, so this is Bligh.
This is Bligh.
And they found him hiding under a bed. And I'll discover the black sheep from my own family. Yes, folks, it turns out I've got a skeleton in my own closet. It's really exciting. He put on a kangaroo skin and bounded out of Port Arthur. This little stone fort, smack bang in the middle of Sydney Harbour, used to be called Pinchgut Island. It's a tourist attraction now, but it's got a really sinister past. Crimes began to be committed almost as soon as the first convicts arrived here, but there weren't any walls or fortifications to lock them up in. What there was this place. Offenders were banished in chains to this nearby island, surrounded by shark-infested waters. From the start, the jailers were outnumbered by the convicts. If things got out of hand, reinforcements could be months away. A terrifying prospect. Admittedly, lots of convicts were little more than pickpockets, but there were also those who were bad to the bone. In 1796, a man called Francis Morgan was sent here for execution as a dreadful and awful example to others, as they said at the time. He'd already committed a murder back in Ireland, which was why he was transported here. But 3 years later, he bashed to death a man called Simon Raven over there on the northern shore. Before the hangman placed the rope over Morgan's head, he was asked for his final words. He's said to have replied nonchalantly, "Death is a morbid subject, and I've no desire to confess my sins. The only thing worth mentioning is the superb view of the harbour I have up here. I'm sure there are no waters in the world that compare with it for beauty." What a strange man he was. Morgan's body was then tarred and hung from the gibbet post. A grim reminder of what happens to those who flaunt authority. They let him swing there for 4 years. Today, the island in the harbour is a posh little restaurant, which is kind of ironic, because back when it was known as Macquarie, it was a place where all the local tribes could meet, fish, and exchange news in peace. But that tradition ended the day Morgan was strung up. How would they feel, do you think, when they saw Francis hanging up?
Aboriginal people were just so horrified by the situation, they would steer well clear of the island, and it's so unlike any types of act that we've seen before.
Weren't they used to that type of punishment?
Definitely not. Our punishments, for an example, would be to shun them from the community. So they were disowned. That was the biggest shame, not cut the life short and make an example out of that human being, out of that living spirit.
When the Third Fleet arrived in 1791, it included a ship full of Irish. And this lot had no intention of succumbing to the rule of British law. The Irish hated the British for colonising their country. The British, in turn, looked down their noses at the Irish as being ignorant for believing in fairies and leprechauns. Back then, there was an idea doing the rounds that the great nation of China was inland just over the mountains. A lot of people believed it, including a number of the Irish. 21 of them made a break for freedom. They all set off to the north. There were 20 blokes and one heavily pregnant woman, but the whole thing was a disaster. They walked for 3 days, during which time one of the men was speared to death by an Aboriginal, another one got heat exhaustion and died, and all the rest of them got lost. They all split up. They were blundering all over the place. And of course, a search party was sent out, and eventually they were all captured, tired, exhausted and naked. But the irony is that the first one to be caught, who was the heavily pregnant woman, ended up nearer to Sydney than she was 3 days previously when she'd started out. '98 is an infamous year for Irish Republicans. It's the year that the battle at Vinegar Hill took place over in Ireland. Could I have 3 pints of Guinness, please? Thousands of Irish rebels gathered on the hillside, most armed with nothing more than a steel pike to take on the might of the British Army. A massacre ensued, and those who survived were exiled to the other side of the world. So, from about the year 1800, the little colony of New South Wales started to fill up with Irish convicts who didn't think of themselves as convicts. They saw themselves as political prisoners, and they loathed the British. And as soon as they got here, they started to organise an uprising. 6 times in 2 years they tried, and each time they failed. Often it was an informant who gave the game away in exchange for a measure of rum. But not everyone could be bought. Here's an eyewitness account of an attempt to get information from 16-year-old Paddy Galvin. He was ordered to get 300 lashes. He got 100 on the back, and you could see his backbone between the shoulder blades. Then the doctor ordered him to get another 100 on his bottom. He got it, and then his haunches were in such a jelly that the doctor ordered him to be flogged on the calves of his legs. He got 100 there, and as much as a whimper, he never gave. They asked him if he would tell where the pikes were hid. He said he didn't know and wouldn't tell. "You may as well hang me now," he said, "for you'll never get any music from me." They put him in the cart and took him to the hospital. By March 1804, they were ready to try again. Most were Irish, but many English convicts also swore allegiance to the cause. In Phillip Cunningham, they had a leader who knew how to organise troops and rally a force. This time, they'd managed to keep the plot a secret. So when 200 of them escaped from Castle Hill, it caught the Redcoats completely by surprise. Major Johnson, leader of the Redcoats, marched 29 soldiers through the night from Sydney. By dawn, they'd caught up with the rebels on a hill outside Parramatta. The army was outnumbered almost 10 to 1. When the Redcoats and the rebels finally met up, there was a big standoff. Would you mind being our Redcoats?
Yeah, no worries.
Sorry to disturb you when you're working. You just line up there, OK? You're Major Johnson, who was the leader of the Redcoats, right? And, guys, would you be the rebels for us? OK, you're Phillip Cunningham, who was the leader of the rebels, and you're going, calm down, everybody, calm down, calm down. And Cunningham, you're going, death or liberty, and you're going, I want a boat back home, I want a boat back home. And the tension is absolutely, you could cut it with a knife, except that it's a trick as far as Johnson's concerned, because he just sneaks a gun out of his pocket and he points it at one of the rebels, and at the same moment, one of his men points his gun at Cunningham, and I don't know what happens next, except it all kicks off, and suddenly they're all firing at each other. Fire at him! You're firing at him. Oh, God. This is a lovely little caricature of what took place that day at Vinegar Hill. That's one of the rebels shouting, death or liberty, and this is Johnson shouting, you scoundrel, I'll liberate you. 9 rebels were killed, a lot more were injured, including Cunningham, although everybody thought he was dead because he'd been run through by a sword, and the rebels thought, we've lost our leader, and ran away. But in fact, Cunningham was still alive, and the Redcoats dragged him off to the government store, and next day they hanged him from the staircase of the store without trial. And they hanged an awful lot of the rest of the rebels, and they just left them dangling there as a gruesome reminder of what death or liberty really meant. What do you think Johnson would think if he knew he'd been buried in the same graveyard as a lot of revolting Catholics?
I think Major Johnson would be spinning in his grave if he had any idea that this was the outcome.
Was everyone who was involved in the uprising Irish?
No, about half of them were English, and they just sort of joined along in the general fun. Samuel Marsden, who was the person in charge of the trials, was absolutely horrified to discover that 4 of the 8 that were going to be hanged had to have their last rites, so to speak, from the Church of England rather than the Catholic faith. And he got around this by saying that his poor, wayward Protestant sheep had been drawn into this most unhappy affair by the wickedness of the Irish Catholics.
Why were the Irish so rebellious?
Well, they were people without many civil and human rights back in Ireland, which became worse when they were transported here, because Ireland was in such a state of constant turmoil at that period that they were tried with no record kept of their sentences. So they could have come for 7 years, 14 years, or life. Now, when they learned that they were here forever, that's when they started to really step up their attempts to escape. And all they ever wanted to do was get away, get on a ship and go home to Ireland.
With the Irish dissidents still swinging from the trees, the authorities began making sure this couldn't happen again. They'd build a place for the worst of the worst. The rebellious and the repeat offenders. With the strictest security yet devised, it would be inescapable. Port Arthur today is as pretty as a postcard. It's a major tourist attraction in Tasmania. And looking at it from here, it's difficult to imagine it was once one of the most terrifying places on Earth. They say that once you got to Port Arthur, you couldn't leave, which was why when it was established here in 1830 as a penal settlement, It was where they put the lowest of the low, the worst criminals and the incorrigibles, or the double damned, those who'd already committed crimes after they'd arrived in the penal colonies. Location was always part of its appeal, but not for the picturesque surroundings. Port Arthur is a natural fortress, accessible only via a narrow strip of land known as Eaglehawk Neck. In its days as the most inescapable prison on Earth, the entrance was protected by vicious attack dogs, tethered across the entrance like wild demons guarding the gates of hell. When you first got here as a convict, you'd be put on really heavy back-breaking work like felling and transporting trees. Although, if you were good, then you'd be taken off that quite quickly and be trained up in a skill like being a sawyer or a servant. If you were bad, though, then you went back on the heavy work, except this time you had to wear these leg irons, which are an absolute nightmare. They chafe you round there. They're so heavy that walking in them is very difficult, but the worst thing is these rivets here, which mean you can't get them off. You're stuck in them 24 hours a day. In fact, they even had to wear special trousers with buttons in them to be able to get their trousers off. But humans being what they are, some of the convicts got rather proud of them. They thought of them as a badge of honour and started polishing them up like a bit of prison bling. The other crazy thing about them was that they had to do coordinated lifting. A whole line of them would lift a tree trunk like that. And when they walked along doing this, they were known as the centipede gang. Van Diemen's Land, as the island was known back then, was truly the end of the earth from a European perspective. Some of the worst atrocities committed in colonial Australia happened here. I suspect in large part because of its remoteness. The Indigenous people of Tasmania were virtually wiped out in a generation. The most chilling story is about a bushranger called James Parrot, who murdered the Aboriginal husband of a woman that he was using for his own purposes, and then forced her to wear the man's head round her neck as a warning to others that he was not a man to be messed with. Of course, not everyone who called Port Arthur home was a violent psychopath. In the case of Billy Hunt, nothing could be further from the truth. Billy Hunt was transported to Van Diemen's Land in the year 1825. He'd been convicted of stealing a handkerchief, which may not sound much, but in those days, handkerchiefs were the must-have fashion item for young gentlemen who used to wear them dangling out of their pockets. And of course, they kept getting nicked. So the law decided to throw its full weight at handkerchief thieves, and he was sentenced to 14 years transportation for stealing one hanky, which seems to me pretty severe even by the standards of those days. But the thing about Billy was that he was a complete nutter in the most charming way. When he got here, he was put in a lunatic asylum, he escaped, and eventually ended up here in Port Arthur. But when he escaped from here, it was the great escape. Steve McQueen couldn't have bettered it. He put on a kangaroo skin and bounded out of Port Arthur. And the story goes that there were these two guards who saw this kangaroo coming towards them, and they were fed up with prison rations and rather fancied kangaroo stew. So they got out their muskets, pointed them at this kangaroo that stuck its hands up in the air and shouted, "Don't shoot, it's only Billy Hunt." What sentence did he get for the kangaroo stunt?
Well, they gave him 100 lashes, which is the maximum flogging that you could legally award. But interestingly, afterwards they charged him again. They charged him with protesting that he hadn't actually been apprehended, that he'd surrendered at Eagle Hawk Neck, which makes me think that the story is in fact true, that he had stuck his hands up in the air.
He was one of these blokes who just couldn't stay out of trouble, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely, and you see his offence record just carries on at Port Arthur. There's a whole heap of little offences. He was done for having a forged shilling in his possession and trying to traffic with it, and he spent a month in solitary confinement for that on bread and water. And he was discovered under the blankets with George Burroughs.
Does that mean what I think it means?
I think it almost certainly does, Tony. And in fact, over the course of his sentence, he clocked up an amazing 1,800 days in leg irons, 625 lashes, and 135 days in solitary confinement.
He was a nutter.
I think undoubtedly. You know, that's one of the sad things about a place like this, is that you tend to think that everybody who comes here is bad, but in fact, you know, in his case, he may have been bad, but he was also certainly mad.
Do we know what happened to him in the end?
Yes, he was sent from Port Arthur to a lunatic asylum. So a building rather like this one. This wasn't built when he was at Port Arthur, but he was sent to an institution rather like this one at a place called New Norfolk.
Poor old Billy. And if physical brutality wasn't enough, the authorities were keen to pioneer an altogether more sinister punishment. They hoped redemption could be earned through isolation and the solitary contemplation of one's sins. So who was sent here?
Everybody. Everybody who was sent to Port Arthur from the late 1840s onwards spent a period of time in here.
And what went on here?
Well, frighteningly, not a lot.
Cool, I can see how you could have kept people in control here. All you need to do is sit down here. You can see up there, and over there, behind me.
Absolutely. Welcome to Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. So, Panopticon, all-seeing prison.
So did you never talk to anybody else?
You only talked to your guards. And the whole idea is that to cut off all communication with their fellow convicts, and so that they would reflect on the error of their ways and what they had done.
It sounds much more scientific.
Absolutely. And it's actually called scientific penal theory. So the idea was that transportation was barbaric, it was old-fashioned, but this is a new way of getting to the mind of the prisoner.
Yeah, because before you just beat people up and
That's right,
whip
absolutely.
them, and now you're doing their heads in.
Okay, yep. And the idea is that it's that psychological emphasis that will result in long-term reform, to actually throw the whole thing onto a reflection of where you had gone wrong.
You know what it reminds me of? Guantanamo Bay.
I think that's the roots of all of that. And prisoners died. I mean, the death rates in buildings like this were much higher than the death rates outside with the hard labour carrying logs and the flogging and all the rest of it. It's really terrifying. Ah! Precisely.
Whenever a prisoner left his cell, he had to wear his face mask. Whenever he broke a rule, he was confined to the punishment cell. They say you could have screamed for days without being heard.
It is so dark in here.
I don't actually see why I need to wear a hat anymore. It doesn't make any difference. You can hear every tiny little noise from a long way off. I'm getting near my tummy rumbling. These boots are killing my feet. I'm going to do something really exciting now. A bit of
sit. You do really start going into yourself. I imagine you could get quite irritated when somebody opened the door and said you've got to go outside and exercise. You'd be just so locked in your head. Can you hear, Tony?
Is that it?
Yeah, you can come out now.
Is that funny? I can't be bothered to get up. Makes you really dozy. It's not something I'd recommend. It's truth.
What was it like?
You know what strikes me most? I'm speaking so quietly, aren't I? I never speak like this normally. What strikes me most is that it's a brilliant form of punishment because nobody's actually punishing you. All you did was chuck me in a dark room. The punishment is just self-inflicted. It's all those anxieties and paranoias and doubts and feelings of lack of self-worth and all that. Well, I don't think I'm particularly messed up, but all that stuff does come to the fore, and you I suppose over a long period you either learn to deal with that and survive, or if you don't learn to deal with it, it would be absolute torture. It really would be like your head was completely haunted by the worst visions in the world.
It's really, really quite terrifying. And one of the things that I find really, really awful about it is that there's no way of resisting.
So it could cure you in a funny sort of way, couldn't it? It could give you a robustness, I suppose. I suppose that's the logic anyway.
Or send you mad.
Yeah. In my case, it's just sent me very quiet. Oh, I'll be glad to get these boots off. But there was one place in the separate prison where you could express yourself. A place where everything and nothing was sacred. Where do I go?
Down the steps, Tony, to aisle D.
Oh, here we are, D.
Yep. In you go, Tony. So
through here?
That, yes, open that door.
It's a bit of a squeeze, isn't it?
Now close it in. So this closes like that. And I'm going to close myself in. And there we go.
So I still can't see my fellow prisoners?
But you can take your mask off now. So that means that you can see the chaplain.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's the only person that you're allowed to see. So it'll encourage you to reform your wicked ways.
Couldn't really muck about in here, could you?
Well, we've got prisoners charged with offences, and there's one that I absolutely adore. There was a guy who was charged with pulling faces, sticking his tongue out, and leering at the chaplain. When he was tried for this, he said, "I admit to all of it, but I did not stick my tongue out."
It's a bit like choir boys, isn't it? I think just about the only act of defiance I can think of is weeing on the floor.
Yes, that's right.
But it would be one of the few things you could do, wouldn't it?
Yes, I'm sure it was done.
You could spend all the time you're being lectured, you could have your willy out. As a place of punishment, Port Arthur had no equal. But as it turns out, it wasn't the prisoners the authorities needed to fear, nor was it the Irish dissidents. The greatest challenge to their authority would come from much closer to home. Put yourself in the shoes of the British authorities. The penal colony you've created more than 17,000 kilometres from home is getting off the ground. But the convicts now vastly outnumber their guards. So you'd imagine you'd want a strong military presence of Britain's finest to keep things in check. You'd think that, but you'd be wrong. As more and more convicts poured into New South Wales, its rulers felt themselves increasingly vulnerable. They knew that they had to rely on the army, but this wasn't the cream of Britain's redcoats. This was a bunch of blokes without prospects, recruited from Britain's poor and unemployed. And they were all too eager to exploit the powerful situation that they now found themselves in. And they did so by using a substance they were already pretty familiar with. Virtually indistinguishable from the convicts except for their red coats, they soon became known as the Rum Corps, the most powerful and unscrupulous group in the colony by far. The redcoats cornered the market in this stuff, rum, although actually the word rum was a catch-all phrase for virtually any strong liquor. They didn't just use it in order to get hammered, though. As far as they were concerned, it was a bona fide currency. The wages for the construction of some of the most famous buildings in Sydney were paid in rum. The wanted posters for the capture of bushrangers advertised the reward in rum. There's even a story that one bloke sold his wife for 4 gallons of the stuff. And it was absolutely disgusting. How did rum come to be the currency? Well, it's a story that goes back to the very beginning of the colony. When Governor Arthur Phillip suddenly returned to England in poor health, he left a power vacuum that the officers of the Corps were quick to exploit. Out went Phillip's instruction that soldiers and convicts should receive the same food ration. Out went collective farms. In came massive land grants to fellow officers. It wasn't long before the Rum Corps officers grew rich, and no one grew richer faster than John Macarthur, owner of the best farming land in the colony and the de facto leader of the Rum Corps. Macarthur had a reputation for being willful and cantankerous, but in the new governor, he finally met his match. His name was William Bligh, already famous all over the empire for having survived the mutiny on the Bounty. What would it have been like when these two came face to face? A clash of the titans? Well, for more than a year, it was actually more like a chess game. OK, so this is Bligh?
This is Bligh.
What was he like?
Oh, Bligh was a stolid man. He was a stickler for the rules. Not particularly imaginative, but certainly someone who took orders but also expected others to obey them.
And what about our chap over here? The king of the troops, who's this?
Well, this is John Macarthur.
Yep.
He was manipulative, he had great moments of depression and other great moments of elation. He had periods when he had a lot of energy. He was always on the move, but then other times when he had no energy.
The word bipolar springs to my mind.
Well, I think that some people now do consider that he was, in fact, bipolar.
So when Bligh arrived, he was tasked to clear up this rum racket.
Bligh's instructions were to break up the rum trade and, of course, to break up the power of the New South Wales Corps, who had made a lot of money in the colony, and to re-establish the rule of the governor. The New South Wales Corps were basically made up of British unemployed who could not get jobs in Britain and would have been nothing. But out here, and particularly officers, they were somebodies.
So what did Macarthur decide to do?
Well, Macarthur was very concerned because Bligh had threatened his land grant, which was the basis of his empire. And so Macarthur tried to exert his authority over Bligh to see who was preeminent.
Were there any similarities between the two then?
There's one thing that unites them, one thing that they share, and that is that when they believe they are right, which is most of the time, they are immovable.
It all came to a head on the 26th of January 1808, 20 years to the day after the colony was founded. The date was no coincidence. MacArthur had managed to convince the Rum Corps that their lifestyle was at stake. The army was ready to depose their boss, the King's representative, and create an entirely new government. In the heat of the day, 400 of them marched the short distance to Government House to arrest the governor. Bligh must have been furious. After all, this was the second time he'd been the subject of a mutiny. The half-drunk soldiers searched high and low, and finally found him hiding under a bed. This is Australia's first political cartoon. It was created within hours of the mutiny and was intended to ridicule Bligh. But does it actually capture what happened? It's not great art, is it?
No, it's not, Tony. It's a fairly ordinary drawing. It's some pretty lousy draftsmanship, but your eye follows the drawing very neatly, and of course, Bligh is the focus. One of the key parts of this is this dramatic pose by this trooper who's leaning down.
It is odd to me, though, that the tyrant of the bounty would have been found under a bed.
Well, that is the argument, isn't it? I mean, I think he was in the Royal Navy from the age of 7 or something like that, and he'd already had one mutiny under his belt, so I don't blame him for cowering under the bed, if indeed he did, but this...
You say if indeed he did, you think he might not have?
I think he probably didn't. I think he was a pretty tough fellow. I mean, he's a hard, old-time Navy man. He'd be fairly fearless. But the troopers hold the key. They are drawn as the great guardians of society. They're like Grenadier Guards. They're magnificently poised.
So in real life, you don't think that the troopers would have looked like that?
No, they're mutineers. They were Rum Corps troopers. They would have been rum-soaked and pretty rough around the edges, and it says so much so people would believe that Bligh was found cowering under the bed with his chamber pot.
So how would you have drawn it differently?
Well, I'd have started with the troopers. Okay, say Bligh was under the bed. The way I'd go about drawing the troopers, I'd draw them like a proper Rum Rebellion mutineer, and they'd be dishevelled. You know, they'd be a bit fly-blown, and you know, they'd be pretty rough around the edges. Don't forget, these guys are using rum as currency. They wouldn't have the fine Grenadier Guard look about them. And I'd have this guy reaching down, grabbing Bligh by the throat, superimpose this bloke on top of this trooper. You'd have a completely different image. You know, here's Bligh and he's being monstered by these mutineers.
Suddenly, you feel quite sorry for Bligh now, don't you?
Yeah, poor old Governor Bligh.
So what became of the players in Australia's only military coup? When this whole incident was over, MacArthur wrote to his wife Elizabeth, "The tyrant is even now, no doubt, gnashing his teeth in vexation at his overthrow." But of course, that kind of overthrow is never permanent, is it? A couple of years later, Bligh was back in England, where he was exonerated, promoted, and by all accounts lived a long and happy life in the bosom of his family. MacArthur? Well, he was forced to live in exile for almost a decade, but as was his way, he turned adversity to advantage. Even before he arrived in England to attempt to clear his name, he'd sold the first bale of Australian merino wool. It achieved a record price and assured his fortune. But there's one more twist in the tale, and it can now be revealed on an archaeological dig. This is Camden Park in New South Wales, which once belonged to John and Elizabeth MacArthur. It's perhaps the most historically important farm in all Australia. A team of archaeologists are now uncovering some of the original buildings that housed the convict workers and possibly John MacArthur himself in his final unhappy years.
The thing that's interesting here, we do have the two-room cottage, fireplace in the end wall, partition wall, and then the second room. But what we've found in this excavation is, in fact, we've got two cottages joined side by side, which is much rarer and really does indicate that the Camden estate was a well-established property. They were building substantial structures to house their workers.
And really lovely views that the convicts would have had.
The best view. This land, as you know, was some of the best pasture land discovered in Australia up to that time. It's known as the cow pastures.
Why?
Because this is where they discovered the cattle that had escaped from the First Fleet landing in 1788. The cattle had sought out the best pasture. John Macarthur knew a thing or two, and this was the land that he wanted for his merino sheep.
It's a bizarre fact that while the First Fleet convicts struggled to eke out a living, the cows they brought with them prospered. It was nearly a decade before the runaway cattle were found. Can you imagine the surprise of the explorers when they emerged from a week bashing through impenetrable bush, only to discover a vast undulating pasture land already populated with a large herd of well-fed cattle? But this is more than a quirky little yarn. Those cows helped transform the colony in a most unexpected way. A few years after the pasture land was discovered, John Macarthur, who'd gone to England to face a court-martial for shooting his superior officer in a duel, no less, managed to convince the colonial secretary to give him title to all this land. And he used it to breed merino sheep. Yup, a gunfight and 6 runaway cows helped start the Australian wool industry. And the wool industry played a key role in making Australia the nation it is today. I just found out something really unexpected. I was looking at this local history book, which has got a list of all the convicts that they know about who were here. And I came across this bloke, William J. Parrot. What intrigued me was that my grandfather's name was Horace Parrot, and his dad was William Parrot, and his dad was Thomas William Parrot, and his dad was William Parrot, and so on and so forth. Lots of Thomas and William Parrots right back to the beginning of the 19th century, which is as far back as we've been able to trace. But what got me really excited was that all my parrots lived around Shoreditch. And when I asked Ted if he knew where William was born, you said...
Shoreditch.
So this bloke could be a member of my family. But Ted, all this stuff is really quite obscure. Do you know what any of it means?
All right, well, it says he was a convict and he arrived in New South Wales in 1791 on the ship called the Albemarle. It doesn't tell us his sentence, but it does tell us what he did when he got it, which was a shoemaker.
And what's this? A lease on CP?
It probably means released on conditional pardon in 1807.
And then he received some land?
That's right. 3 years later, he had a land grant in 1810 at Narellan, which is just south of here, and so was a local man.
I'm really quite excited about this, thank you.
Well done.
Suddenly, it's not just the history of Australia, it's my family's history as well.
Well, that's right. One of your relatives survived the convict system. You should be proud of it.
I think I am. But what was a shoemaker doing working on a farm? Well, if you wanted goods or luxuries of any kind at this time, you had to make them. So skilled convicts, like William no doubt, were valuable assets to the wealthy. In the late 1820s, there'd have been around about 75 convicts working here. According to the 1828 census, these are some of the jobs that they would have done. Blacksmith, wool sorter, general servant, butter churner, milkmaid, and William Parrot shoemaker. The magic of television. Now, I have to confess, I've become just a little bit obsessed with William Parrot. So I'm making a quick detour to dig a little further at the State Library of New South Wales. This is all the stuff that they've pulled together for me about William Parrot. It's really exciting. Here he is, Parrot there, shoemaker. This is the day book from the estate when he was a convict. And this is all the stuff that he bought and sold. Interesting thing here, 12 gallons of wine that he bought at 15 shillings a gallon. So there's something that runs in the family. This is the land that he eventually got. Doesn't look particularly big on this map, but later on when the village of Narellan starts to develop, you can see actually it's very big and it backs on to the whole village. This is a significant piece of property. He's obviously a major player in the village. And there's loads of other stuff, his indenture, clips from various newspapers and stuff, but the one that really excited me was the Old Bailey procedures from when he was originally busted. Look, it says here, William Parrot, committed to stand trial at the Old Bailey on the 8th of July 1789, charged with breaking and entering and stealing a quantity of silverware, the property of Samuel Brooks of Primrose Street, Bishopsgate. And Bishopsgate's only about a mile and a half from Shoreditch where he lived, so he hadn't gone very far. He was 21 years old and he stole 2 silver salt shakers, a spoon, 11 teaspoons, a pot of milk, 2 tablespoons, a cotton gown and 1 silver milk pot. It was a tea set. He got convicted for stealing a tea set, total value about £3. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, but his sentence was then commuted to transportation for life. For nicking a few cups and saucers, a travesty of justice. Well, I suppose you could say it was a lucky break in a way. I wonder what's on his land these days. Now that would be worth finding out. I've come back out to William Parrot's old stomping ground. I haven't found his land yet, but after traipsing all over St John's Cemetery for a few hours, I found his final resting place. I know that he moved here to Parramatta a few years after he bought the place in Narellan. I know that he worked for the government here, that he was a landowner, that he became a police constable and was paid £2 a week for the privilege. I don't know if he ever married or not, but he is recorded as having lived with a woman called Mary Smith at one time. And I know that when he died, aged 56, there must have been somebody who cared about him because they gave him a proper gravestone. I still don't know if he's a member of my family or not, but I am pleased to have found him. It really helps you understand what a tiny place the colony was in William's day when you see that his land grant was personally signed by Lachlan Macquarie, the man who replaced William Bligh as governor. Macquarie is often referred to as the father of Australia. He was the one who finally got the Rum Corps under control, and he was the first to use the word Australia in official correspondence. But there's more to him than that. Macquarie kick-started modern Australia. He oversaw the transition from what was basically a military prison run by hard-nosed Navy men to a more open society of ex-convicts and free settlers. One of his first acts was to issue land grants to emancipated convicts. One of the first grants was William Parrot's. The land at Narellan, backing onto the village. It's a golf club, my family golf club. I own a golf club. Macquarie's other great legacy was his passion for exploration. His support for the early explorers set the scene for the great age of discovery that would soon sweep across the continent like wildfire. Next time the sun struck explorers push inland in search of God knows what, the first thing he did was bite the head of the chief tent man.
They said the bushrangers are coming.
It just looked absolutely terrifying,
It would have been horrible.
And the discovery of gold was a game changer.
Society was transformed.